This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Will a trade war over Trump's tariff threat help vault Ontario Premier Doug Ford and the Progressive Conservatives to an even larger majority? That's the question on the minds of many in Ontario politics as Ford is expected to call a snap election on Wednesday, more than a year ahead of schedule. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. Toronto Sun politics reporter Bryan Passifiume joins me to discuss why Ford is calling an election now, how he hopes it plays into his response to the tariffs threat, and how opposition parties responded to the election call. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Bryan, Ontarians look to be going to the polls a little ahead of schedule. In fact, more than a year ahead of when they were probably anticipating they'd have to vote in another provincial election, as Premier Doug Ford announced late last week that this Wednesday he'll drop the writ for a late February election. Why is it that Doug Ford says he needs to call an election now?
Well, he's with the tariff threat coming up. There's a lot of uncertainty right now with Donald Trump. Ontario is half of Canada's economy. Ontario's largest province. Pretty much the economic engine of Canada. So Doug Ford is, in lack of any sort of leadership coming out of Ottawa since the Trudeau government kind of collapsed and burned there. Doug Ford's been kind of the voice of Canada. Him and Danielle Smith have been kind of the only real voices of Canada. So Ford thinks, at least he claims that he's looking to secure a mandate. He's calling it, he wants Ontario's largest mandate in its history in order to stand up to the tariff threats. That's his justification for it. I think that even if Donald Trump wasn't threatening to do tariffs, he'd probably be looking at another election. We're looking at the same situation that Justin Trudeau had in the last federal election. He held it, seemingly out of the blue. He did it to try to get out of the hole he was in. He was in a minority government. He was hoping for a majority government. He was hoping that the momentum that the Liberals were seeing at that point would help translate into that. Of course, that didn't happen. He was just gifted with another minority government. But in this case with Doug Ford, he's got a good majority, and he's hoping to secure an even larger majority. Whether that happens or not, that's anybody's guess. I've seen some polling that may suggest that he may actually lose a little bit of ground in this election, but that's pretty much where we're at right now.
Now, as you mentioned, the PCs have a pretty strong majority in the Ontario legislature. What is it that Doug Ford says he needs a new mandate for to deal with this threat? Is it just there could be spending attached to it? There could be a financial hit to the province that he needs to address, and he'd rather discuss that with voters during a writ period than kind of spring these new policies on the electorate, unbeknownst to them.
Yeah, and those are the questions that the opposition parties are putting to Ford right now. Is this really the best time for an election? Is a larger mandate even necessary to combat this? This is almost being seen as almost like a referendum of Doug Ford's, not of his policies and his government so far, but almost of how he will deal with the threats being faced by Trump's tariffs. Ontario's, unlike Danielle Smith, Doug Ford is all on board with retaliatory tariffs, retaliation against the tariffs. He's talked about cutting off electricity exports to all the states that border Ontario, and a lot of those states rely on electricity exported from the U.S. to supplement their local grids. And if they lose that, there's a good chance a lot of people could be left in the dark or see their power bills increase. It's kind of become the issue of this election. The Ontario Liberals, for example, they've sent a letter to the Ontario's Integrity Commissioner, calling it an unnecessary election, saying that the election will cost $175 million. So this is an election that the opposition parties are going into grudgingly, but at the same time, they're trying to erode the lead that Doug Ford has right now. They're hoping that the anger over this kind of unnecessary election will translate into more votes for them. So this could either be a master move by the PCs, or this could be a devastating blow to them. I think there's a lot riding on this election for both Doug Ford and the Conservatives.
Definitely. He mentioned in his press conference last week, I think he was just speaking at another event, if I'm not mistaken, that he'll be visiting the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario tomorrow. We're talking Monday, so it would be on Tuesday he's going to visit the Lieutenant Governor. Is there a chance that the LG could say no?
Well, there's always a chance. There's always a possibility that the the Lieutenant Governor might say no. It's a incredibly remote chance. The Governor General, the Lieutenant, any Canadian Viceroy, or any real Viceroy at all, they have no real say in policy or anything like that. If she refuses to grant the writ, that could be a very serious problem. I don't think that's the case. I know a lot of people were trying to convince Mary Simon, Canada's Governor General, to reject Trudeau's prorogation of Parliament. They wanted him. I remember sort of a big plank during the Freedom Convoys. They wanted the Governor General to step in to dissolve Parliament over opinions of Justin Trudeau and his treatment of civil rights and everything during that protest. So I think that constitutionally there's a chance, but realistically, I don't think any lieutenant governor is going to walk that minefield.
Mm-hmm. As you said, all of this is tied up in Trump's tariffs threats. Doug Ford has talked about the possibility of retaliating by shutting off electricity exports. And Doug Ford seems to be on board with this Team Canada approach, and he's not being combative with the Prime Minister, lame duck Prime Minister though he is. So Doug Ford and other premiers have had to step up and perhaps be the face of Canada through all this. Is there anything else that Doug Ford wants to see or potentially wants to do with regard to tariffs, whether that's shutting off resource exports like oil, shutting off resource exports from other provinces, putting retaliatory tariffs on goods coming in from the U.S.? What's kind of Doug Ford's general philosophy here with this potential trade war with the U.S.?
It looks like it's going to be a tit for tat. If things go through, there hasn't been a detailed list of measures that they would take. I don't think anybody wants to tip their hand. But we mentioned electricity exports. There was also talk of in Ontario, all of our liquor stores are all controlled by the government, the LCBO. It's not like they're in Alberta where they're private liquor stores, which is nice. But there was talk about pulling American booze out of Ontario liquor stores. So if you're into Jack Daniels or one of the Jim Beam, better get those now. There's talk of cutting American beer out the stores. We quite recently been able to purchase beer and wine in grocery stores in Ontario, which is a novelty for us here, not for a lot of other parts of North America. But you could be seeing the last of your Budweiser 2-4s in the stores. There's been talk about Florida orange juice going off the shelves. So yeah, so much of our consumable goods are produced in the U.S. Name it. It could be something as annoying as not being able to get a bottle of Jack Daniels, or it could be something as catastrophic as the price of a new car skyrocketing. There's talk of Daniel Smith's point when it comes to cutting off energy exports. Particularly when it comes to oil, the little amount of Western Canadian oil that we get in Eastern Canada comes through, the Enbridge pipelines that go through the U.S. So that's a whole different issue there. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Canada's car industry, for example, is so integrated. Like a new car, parts for a new car built on either side of the Ontario Michigan border. Parts could cross the border several times before they actually make the final assembly, whether that car is built in Ingersoll, Ontario or Detroit. It relies on a supply chain that's cross-border, in a lot of cases, international supply chains. So, what's that going to do with the price of a new car? So, there's we haven't got the full list yet, but I think that if this does go through, all bets are off. All bets are off. It could be anything from a few minor annoyances to some huge fundamental changes in how we live our life.
We'll be right back. Now, if Donald Trump is to be believed, and I know he's been kind of a moving target on this whole notion of tariffs, we could see them come into force as early as Friday, or he could announce them as early as Friday. With that in mind, isn't there concern out there this is perhaps a terrible time to have an election? Like, wouldn't we want to have government more focused on dealing with this possibility of a trade war rather than trying to stir up votes in, North Bay or Timmins, right?
Well, and that's the question, and that's I think it's the question that's going to define this election. Is this election necessary? Is it $150 million waste of money? Will that anger over calling this election translate into lost support for the PCs? It's really, really hard to say. I know that Ford is promising not to not to take his eye off it. He's still the premier. He's going to. He was going to DC in the next few weeks. I believe it's the 12th. I can't, at the top of my head, I can't remember the exact date, but he's going to DC to take part in talks during the election campaign. A lot of people have questions about that. Should he be taking time off from campaigning to do work? Like I said, he's still the premier. He still has responsibility as a part of his job, even though the legislature has been dissolved. So it really this is an election that will be defined by the election, whether Doug Ford likes it or not. Is him calling this election going to translate into people shifting their support? When you look at his opposition, you've got the Ontario NDP, which has been a mess for a while. The Ontario Liberals have a new leader. They have Bonnie Crombie, the former mayor of Mississauga, who is a lot more moderate than her predecessor, who's a bit more level-headed, but she's also taking charge of a party that has its own problems. So honestly, I don't think that Doug Ford's going to have too much of an issue getting a majority. I don't think that he's going to be looking at huge swells of support. We're not going to see, previous elections where, parties going into it and end up getting mysteriously wiped out. I think Doug Ford's going to have his mandate. Whether it's going to be stronger than the one he had going into it, I think that's the question that can only be answered after Election Day. Yeah.
And as you mentioned, an interesting time for opposition parties in Ontario. And I know they're trying to use this as a point on which to argue against Doug Ford and the PCs. They're suggesting that it's all just a distraction from the Ford government's record. What is it they're suggesting that Ford is trying to distract the public from?
Well, there's a lot of controversies going on in Ontario, issues with the Greenbelt, issues with a lot of issues that would be really hard for me to explain without giving a lesson sort of at the intricacies of Ontario politics. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of very questionable policies and things put forward by the Ford government, but this is the opposition party talking. They're everything that Doug Ford does, whether it gets up in the morning and gets a bagel instead of some bacon, is because he's trying to cover something up. That's just what opposition parties do. I don't really pay all that much mind to that because that's just the usual bluster. But I think that that just distracts from the fact that the big question people are going to have going into the ballot box, next month is this necessary? Is this worth it? Is it worth it? Paralyzing the government. Granted that Queen's Park's only going to be shut down for a brief period of time, a fraction of the time that the federal legislature has been shut down after Trudeau prorogued it. But at the same time, when you're dealing with a crisis like this, every moment and every opportunity to pass legislation matters. And that's the question that voters are going to be asking up for.
Yeah. And lastly, is there anything, other than this ongoing nonsense with everything that's happening south of the border, is there anything that you're particularly going to be paying attention to in this election campaign, whether it's, I know everyone talks about in the federal election, what happens with the GTA is really important. Is it a sense of what's going on in Toronto? Are there any other areas you're watching for? Or does it all really just come down to how voters respond to the early election call and whether voters think that Ford needs a stronger mandate to address these tariffs?
Well, these tariffs are they're proven to be a blessing and a curse for Ford because, this is for him easy justification to call the election. If this threat wasn't there, I think you'd have a lot harder time. And I think most observers would conclude that Ford would have called an early election regardless of what's happening south of the border. But it's a curse for him, but it's also a blessing is that it turns into a one issue election. It doesn't matter that, the Greenbelt controversy is still haunting him. The money spent to allow stores to sell beer and wine, all the other issues that people have the challenge. All those get melted away and just turns into one thing, tariffs, which is something that really is largely a federal responsibility. But, Doug Ford has inserted himself in this. Ontario has been inserted itself in this just by virtue of being, Canada's economic engine. So, yeah, whatever issues or controversies Ford was facing, I think a lot of it's going to get washed away when it comes to see how he stands up to President Trump and the tariffs.
Excellent. And I know we'll be watching the election closely. We'll see how things roll out in Ontario over the coming weeks. Bryan, thanks for your time.
Anytime. Thank you so much.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Bryan Passifiume. More from him and more Ontario election coverage at torontosun.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.